Hello, everybody, and welcome to the really interesting module on the topic of developmental psychology and intelligence. Now, many of you might have some theory about how intelligence and developmental psychology are linked together long before we get into the presentations here, but it is probably important to start off with this module by saying that the link between intelligence and developmental psychology has really been around since people looked at this topic of intelligence in psychology on its own. And this area, though it's not necessarily of critical importance in today's research in psychology, was one of the catalysts to bring psychology into our current era and to make it a very popular field of research and to kind of understand how this came about, where intelligence testing came from, what we can do to tie it to developmental psychology. I thought we'd start this module off with a couple different activities and a couple key terms and concepts so we can better understand the link between this topic of intelligence and today's field of developmental psychology. So, as I mentioned, what I'd love to do here to begin this topic of intelligence is first have us do an activity. And this activity is obviously one that you need to do on your own, even though you can discuss it later amongst classmates and in the different discussion forums. And this activity involves you just sitting back and thinking about what it actually means to be intelligent, high, medium, or low on intelligence. Now, most of us have some intuitive sense of what an intelligent person looks like or sounds like, but maybe we've never thought about how a person coming up with a test or a person trying to really define people in different categories actually goes about doing that. So if you could take a minute or two, think back to personal experiences or intelligence tests that you may be taken in the past and figure out if you can come up with a really clear-cut way of defining who's intelligent and who's not in a very simple manner. After you're done thinking about that, let's progress to the next slide and discuss some of the implications that we often come up with when people do try to devise tests just like we're doing here. I'm hoping, if you've done that particular activity, that you've quickly recognized that even though we tend to think of intelligence as a single entity and something that's easily measurable, in fact, some of us have talked probably long before taking this class about this concept of something we'll talk about later called an IQ or intelligence quotient. When we get down to actually trying to test intelligence, this gets significantly more difficult. And that's because even though we all have this general sense of what intelligence is and what it's not, when we're asked to define it, tell somebody what it is, really show the difference from one intelligent person to somebody that's not, this gets a lot more challenging. And that's often because when people start talking about intelligence, we quickly realize that this is a very multifaceted thing. In fact, in the definition of intelligence, people take into account the fact that intelligence really does hit on a lot of different categories. If you look into your textbook or a number of different sources online or in other places, you'll see intelligence often defined as the ability to solve problems, adapt, and learn from the environment. In essence, people who are intelligent can usually thrive in any situation they find themselves in. But obviously, situations vary. There's a lot of different things that can allow us to thrive in the various encounters that we have on a day-to-day basis. And what makes this even more interesting is the fact that even though this general vague definition of intelligence does encapsulate a lot of things that we tie in the topic of intelligence, there's a lot of other things that people tend to, off the cuff, think as indicators of intelligence that really doesn't have much to do with this problem-solving ability that we just talked about. Most often we think of people who are extremely creative as being intelligent, even though honestly, solving a problem creatively or just in a straightforward way really shouldn't be an indicator of intelligence or not if we're just operating simply on that basic definition that we had. Another thing that we tend to think of as indicative of somebody's intelligence is just somebody's interpersonal skills. In fact, a little bit later, we're going to talk about a term called EQ, or the emotional quotient that people could potentially possess, that has some subtle nuance to it linked to this idea of intelligence, even though, in broad definitions, again, your ability to understand the emotions of others, your ability to understand your own emotions, the ability to communicate ideas correctly, or I guess effectively, it doesn't again quite fit this definition of intelligence that we have listed. Another great example of this is people's amazing or very limited memory capacity. Memory doesn't have a place in our definition of intelligence, though. If you've seen somebody who really does have the ability to retain large bits of information, some of you might recall events where you saw somebody say, be able to recall a list of numbers that was gigantic, or meet a whole bunch of people in a room and be able to list off their names after just one encounter. When you see people that do that, you probably have a belief that their memory is not only good, but their intelligence is also probably very high for them to be able to do those things. But that really has nothing to do with problem solving or adaptability. It's a different aspect, the mind's functioning, that we link in our own minds to this definition of intelligence. And another prime example of this is the size of somebody's vocabulary. We tend to think of somebody who can use big words and in very interesting poetic combinations as intelligent, even though, again, this has nothing to do with the definition of the term. And I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse with this, but what I want you to understand from this issue is that when we talk about how intelligence is derived, how we're able to follow the path of somebody's developing intelligence throughout their lifespan, how we're able to compare one person to another so we can understand what triggers intelligence or where it's coming from, this is a very difficult task to accomplish because intelligence is a very multifaceted thing that's tough to really pin down and say, this is exactly what intelligence is, and this is what we should be measuring. Nonetheless, if we're looking at the history of research in this field of intelligence, the prominent thing that we see over and over again is that people do tend to want to know more about this topic of intelligence, even if we can't necessarily pin it down perfectly. And in fact, as we look at the progression of the field of psychology, what we see is that one of the things that really caused psychology to go from kind of being this fringe topic where people just explored topics like sensation and perception, things we've already covered, into really big picture things that drew people into the field. One of the things that was a catalyst for that growth were these things that we call intelligence tests, devices we used that could allow us to compare this ambiguous thing that we called intelligence between individuals or even between species. And as the field of psychology grew, the number of intelligence tests that we had, the debate over which intelligence test would be best in specific situations, became one of the forefront arguments that people in intelligence research had. And to understand, again, the developmental perspective and how intelligence comes about and how we kind of separate ourselves in different aspects of intelligence, we first have to understand where these intelligence tests came from and also the pluses and minuses of the different intelligence tests that we've created over the years. If we're going to go back historically to the beginning of intelligence tests, we almost always have to start with a very important figure in our history, a gentleman named Alfred Binet, who in the early 1900s, with one of his colleagues, Theodore Simon, well, was tasked to do something that nobody had done before, and that was to devise a way to compare the intellectual abilities of one person to another. Now, Theodore Simon and Binet were not asked to do this just because it would be fun. In fact, there was a very specific purpose in mind when the French Ministry of Education came to Binet and asked him to come up with this intelligence test. And it was rooted in the fact that in the early 1900s, France and many countries were actually struggling with quite the economic and also social crisis. There were a number of public schools that had started to become commonplace, but they had started to, because people were going to these schools on a very regular basis, started to really kind of struggle to financially keep these things alive. And what was also happening there in the 1900s is that there was a lot of competition between countries. Countries were trying to educate their kids as much as possible while also trying to kind of conserve as much money in the process. And what France realized in the early 1900s was that even though their education system wasn't necessarily defunct, it was going through a bit of a crisis. They were spending an abundant amount of money to educate their children, and honestly, their country was, in comparison to some of their neighboring countries, starting to fall behind. So the French ministry decided they had to do something about it. And what they recognized when they started looking at this was that it seemed like their schooling was kind of being slowed down very early on when kids were in their first couple years of elementary school, primarily as a result of a couple kids that were kind of keeping everybody back. They said that some of these kids were not necessarily profiting from the traditional education system because their minds just weren't capable of grasping the basic material, and because the teachers had to spend so much time and so many resources on these kids, it kind of detracted from the other children that could potentially move up faster, understand things at a faster pace, because again the teacher's attention to these children that were struggling. So, or I guess that it didn't happen because these teachers were paying attention to the other children that were struggling. So again, the French Ministry of Education asked Binet and Simon to come up with a means of determining who these kids were, figuring out which ones were not going to be capable of profiting from these basic, I guess, school systems that they had already established. So what Simon and Binet did, primarily Binet did, was they came up with very basic, simple tests that asked children to kind of identify things or just follow specific responses. Now, these tests were not meant for adults. They weren't even meant for teenagers. They had them do things like point to their toes or count the number of fingers that they had, or be able to kind of pick a color that fell into a series. Or if we got into a little bit more difficult things, they could ask them to do something like define a word, like justice. And from this, they were able to derive from these children what their mental age was. And because Binet and Simon weren't looking for anybody that was extreme on the positive end, right? They didn't care if there was an exceptional 5-year-old that was doing better than everybody else. They just cared about the ones that were really struggling. What they really focused on were children that had mental ages that were significantly lower than their chronological ages, their actual physical age in years. And they weren't just looking for kids that were a slight bit behind everybody else. They were looking for the ones that were potentially years behind their peers at a very young age. And their hope was that once they found these kids, they could get them out of the school system and make the school flourish. Now, Binet and Simon had ulterior motives as well. They really wanted to help these children that had already been indicated as ones that struggled. And in fact, after Binet devised some of the first intelligence tests, most of his career was spent trying to create remedial help for these children that were very low in intelligence at a young age. And Binet, even though to this day is not credited necessarily for the work that he did later, he's primarily credited for these intelligence tests. Most researchers that look at Binet argue that even though his original tests might have been used for some rather saddening things, having kids removed from a traditional school system because they were maybe struggling a little bit, his work, his intervention work in future years, definitely made up for some of the implications that came along with his early tests. And in fact, he brought on a new movement to really help with special education programs that still is with us today. Now, after Binet's research kind of established a baseline for how we could compare intelligence of individuals, there was this huge upswell of research and interest in this topic of comparing people's intellectual capabilities. And a lot of these things rested in some well, kind of less than reputable ideas. One of the themes that started to pop up, and we're going to talk about this later, was the topic of heritability and intelligence. Is intelligence something that's inborn within us, or is it something that's a byproduct of the environment that we encounter? And we're going to talk about some research revolving around that later, but note that this was one of the very first things that people started to discuss once there was an intelligence test that was out there. Another thing that started to pop up was this theory of what we call eugenics, this notion of trying to, if we do see intelligence as something that's heritable, and to maximize the potential of a country or a set of individuals by encouraging their genes that have high levels of intelligence tied to them to be passed on. We're going to talk about this idea of heritability of intelligence later, but it is important to note that with this idea in mind of eugenics, of heritability of intelligence, one of the first steps that people took after Binet was to kind of find a way to mass market intelligence tests so people could explore these topics of heritability, of eugenics, of trying to find ways to compare intelligence of not just those that are really struggling to those that are average or above average, but everybody across the spectrum. One of the champions of this march, of this attempt to diversify intelligence tests, was a gentleman actually located down at Stanford named Lewis Terman, who in the early to mid 1900s developed a very famous test called the Stanford Binet IQ test. And this IQ test diversified itself. It also created more difficult questions so it could be administered to adults. And theoretically, it allowed us to measure a lot of different intellectual capacities of individuals and compare the intellectual capacities of not only just the ones that were really struggling to the ones that were fairly average, but allowed us to compare intellectual capabilities of everybody. And to do this, the first IQ or intelligence quotient was devised. And what Terman did in his intelligence quotient was he just took a child, kind of calculated out their mental age based on the performance of the test that they were given, and divided that mental age by their chronological age, how many years old they were, and multiplied that ratio by 100. And this allowed him to not only indicate those that were really struggling, but again, those that were doing above average. He was able to say, look, if you're average, you'll have an IQ score of 100. If you're better than a large portion of your peers, you could be getting into the 150, 200, 400 range, depending upon kind of how exceptional you are. And that became one of the main focuses of Terman because he was not only a very interesting researcher just because of all the different types of intelligence that he looked at or kind of aspects of intelligence that he looked at in his test, but also because he was a huge advocate of this push for eugenics. He really wanted to see us create a world where the United States in particular was significantly more intelligent than other countries through kind of promoting genetic predispositions for these intellectual capabilities. Now, there are obviously a lot of distasteful things tied to this theory of eugenics. One of the biggest problems that started to pop up once Terman started pushing this idea was this notion of not only trying to kind of encourage intelligent people to kind of push their genes, have as many children as possible, but also the theory that maybe sterilizing individuals for low intelligence was also a good idea. In fact, there were many stories tied to Terman's research about people trying to go into different places and different areas where there was this kind of inherent belief that everybody in these areas was less than intelligent, and even trying to kind of sterilize these people. Now, there's not a lot of research that can verify some of the more audacious stories tied to this push for eugenics in the early 1900s. But it certainly is a black mark in the United States history when we look at kind of some of the disreputable things that started to emerge and really unsavory conversations that started to pop up, often tied to things like socioeconomic status and race, when intelligence tests started to become a more commonly looked at thing. And if we're going back to the natural progression of intelligence tests and what was really critical here, I want us to just recognize that these Stanford Binet tests developed by Terman open the door to looking at intelligence in a lot of new ways. The next big step in intelligence tests actually came as a result of a very famous psychologist slash clinician named David Wexler, who decided that these original tests that Terman had come up with were a very good step in the right direction, but they needed to be more diverse if we were going to be able to look at this idea of intellectual ability from a scientific perspective. Note that Wexler was not an advocate for eugenics, at least that I know of. He was just somebody that wanted to look at the topic of intellectual ability from a clinical level and also from kind of a general research level. So what Wexler did first was he revised the test to make it what we call standardized. So instead of calculating out somebody's mental age and chronological age and multiplying that ratio by 100, Wexler said, okay, I want to take everybody at a specific age, give them a test, and kind of compare them to each other so I can determine somebody's IQ. So if you're average with everybody within your age group, you'll get an IQ score of, well, again, like we saw with the last one, 100. But if you're doing better than people of your own age or worse than people of your own age, instead of figuring out roughly what mental age somebody was at, he said, let's just compare what percentage of people, the individual is doing better than to figure out what their IQ score is once they're kind of above or below average. And this led us to what we call the normalized curve. Now, there is a lot of research to show that even though Wechsler's tests do normalize intelligence distribution, so roughly 84% of the population were going to score below 115, or 50% of the population will always get a score below 100 for giving them intelligence tests. This is what we call a forced scale. Most people given intelligence tests in the Wechsler scales or even some of the old Terman tests tend to perform fairly well on these intelligence tests. And to differentiate the score for somebody who, say, earns 130 versus 115, or I should be more precise. So the difference between somebody who scores a 130 versus a 145 on these Wechsler scales, the differences in their performance is minimal at best. These individuals are almost identical to each other, where the same difference on the other end of the spectrum, somebody who scores a 70 versus a 55, what we usually see there is fairly robust differences in their performances on these tests. Very few people score really poorly on intelligence tests. So many people score really well on these intelligence tests, or perform, not score, but perform so well on these intelligence tests that we have to be kind of nitpicky in the top to differentiate between the really intelligent and just the sort of intelligent. But nonetheless, his tests with this kind of forced normal curve allowed us to compare people in a completely new way. His test also opened up the possibility of kind of coming up with different tests for different age groups. So one of the main complaints that people often had with Terman's test and Simon and Binet's tests were the fact that these tests simply were too easy in the beginning. Many people would just go through a series of questions that were obviously going to be answered by everybody before they started to get to the real difficult questions. And there weren't very many different questions in these early tests to differentiate between the extremely intelligent. So what Wechsler did was he created a test for children that contained a large number of simple questions and only a few very difficult ones. And then he also created something called the WAIS, which was the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And it was the first to allow us to look at not only the so-so intelligent children, but the kind of range of intelligent adults. And kind of looking at those that were very high versus very low, and being able to really pinpoint where those differences lied. And to kind of make this even more robust, Wechsler added to some of the original intelligence tests and tools that had been developed by Terman and Binet and Simon. He started looking at things like nonverbal skill abilities, memory capacity, processing speed skills, which had a wide variety of different really interesting tests that had never been thought of before. And through these different subscales, he was able to not only determine a person's overall level of intelligence, but he could also, with these tests, be able to pinpoint somebody's performance on these subscales in comparison to others just at the skill itself. So you could get an IQ score for your working memory, not just your overall intelligence. And that really, again, opened up the door for a lot of extra research and also for clinicians to look at which aspects of cognitive ability somebody was really struggling with so they could potentially help those individuals with just those certain things that they were struggling with. Wechsler's scales are still used today by a large number of individuals within the psychological community, but in particular, they're used a lot in the clinical field for early testing or early intervention practices that we will actually be discussing a little bit more as we progress here. Of course, when we're looking at these tests and the development of it's really critical to bring back our attention to the fact that when we talk about intelligence through the lens of these tests, we are kind of limiting our scope of how we define intelligence. Right? If I talk about somebody as being very intelligent because of what they scored on a test, my, I guess, ability to describe their intelligence is limited to the range of intelligence that that test can actually get at. And it's based on the assumption that when you're answering a pen and paper questionnaire or when you're doing all these weird puzzles that you've never encountered before, that your performance in that situation is going to be indicative of how you're going to perform in the world around you, how you're going to react to things and adapt in the situations that you encounter on a daily basis. And this is always a big concern just on the surface when we're looking at a person-to-person basis, but it's an even bigger concern when we start talking about using these tests to compare people not within a specific group, but across large groups. And when we start comparing cultures, when we start comparing people who had different upbringings, learning about how these tests are devised, how much weight we put on different types of performance is really critical because they can really steer the discussion on intelligence and where it's coming from, how we can compare groups and what's heritability's role in this. It can really steer those conversations in some unusual directions. But now that we've covered the basic tests that are out there, what I thought we'd do is talk about some other types of intelligence that have been looked at and also some things that have kind of, I guess, come out of these intelligence topics over the years since they were introduced to us in the early 1900s by the again, very famous researcher Alfred Binet and his partner, Theodore Simon. We'll talk about that in the next half of this module.